This is the third time recording this episode. The first time, it recorded into the wrong microphone.
Having wings on his sandals, which I just said,
The second time, I had my speed sped up, and I sound like this.
Did I really just use the wrong microphone? I sure did.
Usually, technology doesn't hurt me like this. But it has this week.
Well, time to record all over again.
And I think I know why. I'm your host, Emily Prokop, and this is the story behind Mercury Retrograde. But first, a quick message. I've talked before about my side project called Podcast Share, and I hope you're following along on Twitter at Podcast Share. If you're not, Podcast Share is a Twitter account that is taken over every week by a different curator to kind of live tweet what podcasts they're listening to. The curators are made up of other podcast hosts and listeners, and it's a really fun project, and I hope you'll join me in checking it out by following Podcast Share on Twitter or going to the website podcastshare.net to find out more. Ever have one of those days where everything seems to go wrong? How about a week? How about a 3-week period, maybe 3 times a year? If you've ever heard coworkers blaming their computer problems on Mercury in retrograde, or apparently the grammatically correct way to say it is Mercury retrograde, you might wonder what that actually means. Back in the 2nd century CE, the Roman astronomer Ptolemy popularized the theory that the Earth was the center of the universe. So before there was TV or YouTube, back then people studied the stars at night. The brightest heavenly bodies were given the name of Roman gods, including Mercury, which could be seen from Earth. Its movement was tracked, and while most of the year it would move in one direction among the other stars and constellations, every 4 months for about 3 weeks, it appeared as if it were moving backwards. In the 16th century, Nicolae Copernicus ventured to propose that the sun was in fact the center of the universe, and the planets, including Earth, revolved around it. This made the idea of a planet retrograding more plausible. Retrograde, by the way, means it's moving backward, or at least it appears that way. Mercury, being closer to the sun, revolves around it at a quicker pace than the Earth. A year on Mercury lasts about 88 days. While it's orbiting, though, as it passes the Earth and we see it with the backdrop of the other stars in the sky, it actually looks like it's moving backward to us, even though it's in fact passing us, just in the other direction. One way to think of it is picture yourself in a car. Now picture another car ahead of you, but going at a slower speed. As you pass that other car, it may appear to be going backward, when in fact it's still going in the same direction. So that's retrograde. But why does Mercury retrograde in particular seem to be the popular scapegoat for things like miscommunication or problems with technology? Let's talk about the god Mercury for a minute here. Mercury was the Roman equivalent of the Greek god Hermes. Similar to Hermes, Mercury sometimes has wings on his helmet or sandals. Before we talk about the Roman god, though, we have to talk about his predecessor Hermes, who was the son of Zeus and the nymph Maia, who was one of Atlas' 7 daughters. He was known as the messenger of the gods, which is why he's associated with communication. He's also depicted as carrying a winged rod with 2 snakes wrapped around it called the caduceus. And if that sounds like the symbol associated with medicine, fun fact, and this is actually a bit of a tangent, the symbol you might often see in a medical facility is actually associated with commerce because of Hermes. But it's confused with the rod of Asclepius, which is a single rod with 1 snake swirling around it. Asclepius, or Asclepios, is a Greek demigod associated with medicine. Back in Greece, if you were feeling ill, you would go to temples of Asclepius, pay money to sleep in the back most holy room, and when you woke up, you would tell the temple priests your dreams, and they would prescribe you pharmacon, which was a medicine of sorts. The snake in both these symbols represented regeneration, as a snake sheds its skin. But just to be clear, if you ever want to be that guy in your doctor's office and you see the 2 snakes on a winged staff, you can tell them they are actually using the wrong symbol for medicine. When the Romans adopted many of the Greek gods and made them their own, Hermes became Mercury, and many of his traits went along with him. The planet was probably named for him because of how quickly it moves, since it's the closest to the sun. Since the traits of the gods became associated with the planets they were named for, when studying the paths of the planets in the sky, anything Mercury, the planet, did was associated with the traits of that god. Now, can Mercury, the planet, really affect things in our world today? Well, let's look at some of the things warned against doing while Mercury is retrograding. Even the Farmer's Almanac, while a trustworthy source for information about planting, warns against signing contracts while Mercury retrogrades and advocates for allowing extra time for travel, or even waiting until Mercury is prograding to make any final decisions on anything important. Writings about the effects of Mercury retrograde have been traced back to the 18th century, when farmers would plan their crop planting around the stars. And the popularity came about again in the 70s when newspapers began printing horoscope, with Mercury becoming associated with bad omens. And to be honest, until researching this episode, anytime I was having trouble with technology or dealing with someone who is angry or having trouble communicating, I was one of the many in recent years to look up if Mercury is retrograding, which has been an increasing Google search since 2004. There's even a website, ismercuryinretrograde.com, just in case you want to check to see if you can blame your bad Wi-Fi on it. Now, while there are plenty of awful things that happen to have occurred when Mercury was retrograding in the past, such as the first death from Ebola in the United States in 2014, the Aurora, Colorado shooting in 2012, and the 2010 earthquake in Haiti, there are plenty of instances where Mercury retrograde didn't have an influence. One such instance would be the signing of the Declaration of Independence, which happened while Mercury was in retrograde. Well, I guess that wasn't such a good thing for Britons, so I don't know. You decide. Information for this episode was sourced from Ancient History Encyclopedia, Mental Floss, NASA, and more links which can be found in the show notes at thestorybehindpodcast.com. This week on Trivia Tuesday in the Story Behind discussion group on Facebook, Beckett found out the wacky snow-sleet hybrid she had all over her daffodils this week is evidently called Grapple. And if you'd like to share your trivia you pick up throughout the week, be sure to join the Story Behind discussion group on Facebook. This episode was brought to you by the Story Behind executive producers, who support the show through the Patreon page at patreon.com/thestorybehind. Thanks for listening. This recording better have worked, or I'm giving up until April 15th.